When it comes to election, regardless where we are, one of the most exciting moments and to understand that the new leader is ready to take over the whole country. And given the fact today, we're living in a rather complicated and also what we called intricate geopolitical atmosphere. If we look at the nation from the US and all the way to the countries in Southeast Asia, every single country today, it's eyeing for the political stability. But again, as the saying goes, it is much easier said than done these days. Especially the economy plays another major factor when it comes to the political ambition. Well, if you follow the news closely, again, youth within the nation of Senegal, they actually celebrated recently. And given the fact, this nation, as we're speaking right now, successfully elected another president. If you remember that Senegal is one of the crucial countries on the continent of Africa. Now, what do we understand from this newly elected leader? And also, what does that say about the future for the party? And most importantly, how does the election in Senegal actually relate to the ongoing political upheaval and also this political uncertainty, not just about the continent of Africa, and also related to the rest of the world? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Scott Morgan. Scott Morgan has been the president of Red Eagle Enterprises since its inception in November 2012. He uses his experience from serving in the U.S. military to address various projects, and he's currently based in Washington, D.C. He specializes in U.S. policy towards Africa, focusing on security, religious liberty, and of course, the domestic elections around the continent. Well, brother, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you, Will, and good morning from Washington.
Well, good morning to you. Well, again, Scott, I want to dive into the question right away. As I mentioned in the intro, the nation of Senegal, as you and I were speaking right now, has successfully elected the next president. Now, help us with better understanding based on our previous discussion regarding the nation's political instability and also this economic uncertainty. How significant is the election? And also, what does that mean when we see this time we actually, or the nation actually selected a brand new leader? What do you say to that?
That the events so far this year, I would say you can actually say Senegal has gone through a decade in 90 days. As part of our previous conversations, it was the case of not so much Macky Sall wanting to remain in office as president. We can actually say, honestly, this was a case of the party wanting to remain in power, which is why we saw certain things. That's why we saw Osman, the main opposition leader, who was actually in jail for a long period of time. But and then there's controversy regarding the voting rolls, who was actually going to be able to run for the position, which then Macky Sall said, like, well, let's postpone it to December, even though his term of office actually expires next Tuesday, April 2nd. Is the date that he would be leaving the presidential palace. So that would have created even more problems. Like if he officially had to leave on April 2nd, who was actually going to govern the country? So, and then the Constitution, of course, like we're not going to go through that. So, and they set the election date for March 24th, which was for the Western Christians, Palm Sunday. Turnout was high, and believe it or not, there are few problems. Generally in some cases, some election cycles, we actually hear, different minute problems. People going to the wrong polling place, their names not on the voting roll. You generally hear issues like that. We did not hear a lot of that in these elections. which is a positive sign. Things can be done.
Hmm.
The victory by the opposition candidate, well, it depends on who you talk to. Is this a huge rebuttal to Macky Sall's party for the shenanigans they pulled? We can say that. People wanted to go out and vote. They wanted to have their voices heard, and they did. The party's out of power, and Senegal will actually maintain its source of stability in a region where it desperately needs it.
Hmm.
Even though in the region, Sierra Leone is relatively stable, it had a little bit of chaotic elections, and much to the surprise of a lot of people, the Liberian elections was also stable as well. But as for the other issues, the Troika, Mali, Burkina, and Niger, who were rejoicing when Macky Sall postponed the elections because he was actually one of their vocal critics, and then they were feeling a certain amount of schadenfreude. But now Senegal's had the polls.
Hmm.
They'll have a new president on April 2nd. Country will move forward. Investments will increase. And we will see what policies will be followed up on, because as you know, DP Ports has invested a lot of money and capital into improving the port at Dakar. Seeing efforts by the previous government in Senegal to improve the hydroelectric generation, including hydropower, and they were actually planning on sharing it with both Gambia and Guinea-Conakry. And the efforts to increase the exploration for oil and natural gas, that will actually increase as well. And then also there's sizable amounts of gold that's available in Senegal waiting to be mined. So that is another issue. So Senegal is actually in a good position. I mean, and the investor markets are actually bullish on the country right now, because I don't know if you have noticed, but if you look at the Senegalese bonds that are actually available so people can go and invest, they're, for the last 48 hours, those bonds have been increasing in value. So people, the optimism about Senegal, despite the recent electoral events, has not abated. It may actually be increasing. So, and in a region of Africa that desperately deserves it right now.
Scott, I want to move on our conversation regarding the trade policy. I mean, again, you're the expert. Let's talk about the geographical location of Senegal, and also let's talk about this trade policy. I mean, again, we have to go back to the predecessor, which is Macky Sall. But looking forward, how do you think that today, when we look at this election, that is going to affect directly with the trade or economic relationship between Senegal and some of the neighboring countries? I mean, again, you and I, we had several discussions before regarding this economic agenda under the predecessor Macky Sall. I mean, he had a bigger ambition, and of course that he was reaching for the bigger goals, and so to speak. But meanwhile, Senegal, because was dealing with internal political turmoil that affected greatly regarding this trade economic agenda. But right now, again, according to the report, that it was a peaceful day on voting to elect Senegal's next president. So what can we expect when we look at this economic and the trade agenda? It's not just about Senegal, it's more about its partnership or the relationship between Senegal and other ideal economic partners, or we called cooperatives. What do you say to that?
That is actually a great point. And when you actually talking about regional partners, the first country people automatically think of is the Gambia, because the Senegal encompasses entirely the country of Gambia. Senegal provides most of the country's electricity and trade, so that'll be the barometer that people will use as a measuring stick to determine how the policies of Senegal will actually move forward. Although there are others, they'll actually take a look and wonder, what will the relations be with France? Because generally, Francophone African country, that will be one of another measuring stick that people will go. Because if you look, with the opposition winning the election, there's a train of thought that France may actually be one of the losers in this election. Granted, it's not going to be much of a turnaround. Not much of a turnaround. A little more than a week. So basically, we're going to have to wait till the new president assumes office to determine what the policies will look like. We know that the cabinet's in the process of being formed right now, and then the president will probably unveil his strategies regarding really continuing the trade and investments and everything, which a lot of people expect will happen. But I think a lot of other people will actually will try to determine what will the relations be with the regional neighbors. Senegal has also been one of the key voices in ECOWAS as well. And we will see, as part of the region, we'll see how will as they call it, the Troika, Mali, Niger, Burkina, how will they, it's not a question of if they will reach out to the new government in Dakar. Question is when. What form will it take? Because those three countries are landlocked, and they only have access to certain ports. Accra, Accra is a major one. Cotonou's another source, another site, and you're seeing Chinese increasing investment there. During the time that the UN peacekeepers were in Mali, a lot of their heavy freight and armored vehicles actually entered Africa through Dakar. So that is another thing to watch out for. So as it comes to regional politics, this election will it be a bellwether? It's expected to be a bellwether. What the future looks like. That is a good question. Because as I mentioned earlier, some people expect a certain hostility towards France now. But will Senegal continue to be another voice in ECOWAS, criticizing the military dictators, military coups and dictatorships? We don't know. Another issue that people should watch out for is how far will Senegal go to assist its other neighbors, not just economically, but also with the rise of militancy. Because we have been noticing an increase of attacks in both, not just Benin, but also Togo, and in some cases northern Ghana, which I have posted about on Militant Wire. That's an issue that some people, in Brussels, Paris, and even in Washington will actually be watching to see how they respond to that as well.
Scott, I want to bring another factor into our conversation. Now, I don't want to call it as a religious sense, but the voting process took place during Ramadan, which is the holy month when observant Muslims fast from dawn until dusk. Now, we know that many countries on the continent of Africa constitutes the majority of the Muslim believers. Now, how much do you think this actually played into the factor or into the reality when we look at the political change in the nation of Senegal. I mean, again, this is a critical period for the nation. But also, if we pay attention to other parts of the world, many things could have happened during the Ramadan month. But again, as a matter of fact, during the election process, we saw this peaceful transition. We saw this peaceful voting process during the month. What is your expertise on regarding this Ramadan period? I mean, again, how relevant it is to what's happening in the Senegal today. What do you say to that?
That's an interesting question because, we have seen that as an argument in front of the UN Security Council about getting a ceasefire during the Gaza crisis. The goal was we need to have a ceasefire before Ramadan takes over. Before Ramadan begins. And during Ramadan, people just fast during the day and they still go about their daily activities without interruption. So you generally did not see that much of an issue because you generally didn't hear a lot of the international media talk about why they're having this election on Palm Sunday. Not Palm Sunday during Ramadan, but also, there's this small Christian community there, and you didn't hear them complaining about why they were all going to vote on Palm Sunday. Also, the religious concerns generally do not play out as it does in some other countries in the region. It's they're Muslims, but they're almost like a mini France. It's a very religion plays a part. You didn't notice any imams criticizing the fact that they were actually voting during Ramadan. So or if it did happen, it did not rise to the level of people trying to get us to ceasefire in Gaza.
Scott, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, since you mentioned the ceasefire in Gaza, now let's bring Israel into our conversation. Again, if you follow the news closely, that Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel, should we say, it's not quite happy regarding the Biden administration's performance regarding the war in Gaza. And of course, that from Benjamin Netanyahu's perspective, it is crucial that we need to eliminate or take out the Hamas completely. I mean, again, given the fact that what happened on October the 7th, it's rather devastating and it's not fair for the international community. But meanwhile, some argue that US today, despite this political intricacy, the US today is trying to rebrand itself on the continent of Africa and also in the Middle East. So at this moment, what is your assessment when we look at the US strategy, especially, I guess we'll say, rebuild this relationship between US and some of the countries in Africa? Is it still too late to rebrand itself as we're looking at this political uncertainty in the US today? What do you say to that?
If the United States wants to rebrand itself in Africa, it should not use the same strategy and language that they used when the State Department sent Molly Fee to Niamey within a couple weeks ago, which the junta actually viewed her comments and stating that she spoke in such a condescending tone that to the point where the U.S. is going to lose more than $100 million airbase for UAV activities, providing security and intelligence to the juntas. And, that's on the verge of that. And the person we sent also has a poor reputation. She was actually in Khartoum before the fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF broke out. And she tried to go they also sent her to Equatorial Guinea to try and prevent that country from leasing out a naval base to China. last year, and that did not work out well for the administration either. But also, there's another country that we should also pay attention to, and that's South Africa. I was actually in the room for one of the events where for the foreign minister of international affairs. Almost got caught calling her foreign minister. Several journalists here in DC actually did that. But, and she was talking about how the U.S. and South Africa are good partners, but they have differences in language, in conversations right now. Because South Africa brought the case against Israel to the ICJ, but a lot of people here think that the country is actually tone deaf because, twice Omar Bashir, the then president of Sudan, went to South Africa for a summit. A court in South Africa actually said, yes, you have to execute the warrant and take him into custody. That never happened. And then Hamedi, the leader of the RSF, went to South Africa, who is also under an ICC warrant for his actions. He went there, was unmolested. But then South Africa takes this case to against Israel to the International Court of Justice, and people in Washington lose their ever-loving minds. But also, another thing that we should also watch out for, because I don't know if you saw it yet, there have been a couple of pieces that have come out this week talking about how Africa is the scene of a potential new proxy war between the Gulf states. Some of the conflicts are now being seen as a proxy war between Iran and the Gulf states. And it's like, if I could go back to Niger for a second, one of the reasons why the junta felt that the Mali was being condescending towards them is because she actually accused the junta of preparing to sell yellow cake to Iran. And we all know what happened the last time the U.S. accused Niger of potentially selling yellow cake to an Middle Eastern country. We invaded Iraq in 2003. So there are a lot of moving parts. Some places, countries, the U.S. relationship is doing well with its outreach. In Africa, other places, it's just being done horribly. Part of it is due to the inconsistency from this administration.
Well, Scott, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. When we look at the international crisis today, one thing is on everyone's mind. It's regarding what we called agricultural production. I mean, again, food, it's everything. But because of the war, because of the international crisis, food price has gone up for some countries. And some countries today are actually suffering from food shortages. We're looking at wheat, crops, vegetables, and etc. So, Scott, I want to get your final thoughts when we look at this economic agenda in Senegal and also the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel, and everything going on. How much do you think that it could impact the food production in a general sense? And do you think that the nation of Senegal can be one of the effective partners to solve, maybe not solve, but at least contribute to the positive outcome? Your final thoughts.
Oh, without a doubt, Senegal can contribute to the positive outcome. But actually, if we want to, going back to the war in Ukraine for a second, Ukraine has announced that it will be it plans to open up new embassies in Africa this year, and also they're also planning on increasing their own shipments of wheat to the African continent. They're not going to nitpick and send the vitally needed food substance to specific countries like what Russia's doing. But one of the things is they talk about sending like wheat. but there are other necessary items that could be sent. Not just meat, but what about fertilizers and heirloom seeds? Those could be sent as well to not just to the countries as well. One of the things that one of the products that Senegal is actually known for, but very few people talk about, is actually the timber industry. So that could be another potential source of revenue for Senegal. And Senegal is also the source of an illicit product that people probably will find interesting, and that's cannabis. So how they regulate that, how the new government regulates the cannabis trade could also determine how people will determine whether or not, if they're serious or not about whether maintaining the status quo or including or working on the investment projects that Macky Sall has started. The hydroelectric power will actually be a huge benefit, not just to Senegal and the region, because that'll be a start. And that way they can actually increase production and other activities. And people forget also, Senegal could also become a tourist destination now.
Well, again, we don't know what's going to happen to the country after the recent election. But one thing we do know, that a peaceful transition is necessary when we look at the word democracy and when we look at this democratic value around the world. And we hope and I pray this country will continue to thrive, not just on this economic level, but also in a greater political aspect as well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite Scott Morgan. Again, Scott Morgan has been the president of Red Eagle Enterprises since its inception in November 2012. And he's based in Washington, D.C. We strongly encourage everyone go online to connect with Scott, especially regarding the projects and also the U.S. policy towards Africa, focused on security and the religious liberty. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. So thank you so much for doing this.